Nobody paid much attention to the rusted sedan parked behind Miller's auto repair. The abandoned car had sat there for years at the edge of a small Montana town, slowly disappearing beneath dust, weeds, and forgotten time. But every morning, 71-year-old garage owner Walter Miller noticed something strange. His old Labrador, Buddy, kept wandering toward the car and refusing to leave. At first, Walter thought the dog had found a squirrel or some forgotten food. Then one cold autumn morning, Buddy began barking desperately beside the vehicle. When Walter opened the back door, he found a frightened 12-year-old boy sleeping beneath a pile of blankets. The child claimed he was fine and begged not to be reported. But Buddy knew something Walter didn't. The gentle Labrador, who trusted almost everyone, growled whenever certain vehicles passed the garage, and every time the boy saw one of them, fear appeared in his eyes. Before long, Walter would discover that the child wasn't simply homeless. He was hiding from something dangerous. And the old dog was the first to realize that someone was still looking for him. A cold autumn wind swept across the wide valleys of western Montana, carrying fallen leaves through the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge, a small town nestled between rolling hills and distant mountain peaks. Walter Miller unlocked the front door of Miller's auto repair just before sunrise, as he had done nearly every morning for the past 40 years. At 71 years old, Walter moved slower than he once had, but he remained a sturdy man with broad shoulders, earned through decades of lifting engines and repairing vehicles. His silver hair was cropped short beneath an old work cap, and a neatly trimmed gray mustache framed a face weathered by long days spent outdoors. Most people in Cedar Ridge knew Walter as a dependable mechanic who charged fair prices and never turned away someone who truly needed help. Few knew that he had lived alone since losing his wife Margaret 7 years earlier. The grief never fully left him, but it softened with time, helped in no small part by the companionship of Buddy, his 10-year-old yellow Labrador retriever. Buddy was beginning to show his age. White fur surrounded his muzzle, and he no longer chased tennis balls with the speed he once possessed. Yet his warm brown eyes remained alert, and his gentle nature made him beloved throughout town. Every day the Labrador followed Walter around the garage, greeting customers and napping near repair bays while engines hummed in the background. On that particular morning, however, Buddy behaved differently. As soon as Walter opened the garage, the dog trotted past the service bays and headed toward the rear lot, where an old rusted sedan sat abandoned near a chain-link fence. The vehicle had belonged to a customer who disappeared years earlier. Legal complications prevented Walter from disposing of it, so it remained there gathering dust and slowly becoming part of the landscape. For nearly a week, Buddy had shown unusual interest in the car. Each morning he wandered over, sniffed around it, and sat nearby for several minutes before returning. Walter initially ignored the behavior. Dogs develop strange habits. But today, Buddy refused to come back. The Labrador stood beside the rear passenger door barking sharply. Walter frowned. "What's gotten into you?" he called. Buddy barked again, not the playful bark he used when greeting visitors. This sounded urgent. Concerned, Walter walked across the lot. Fallen leaves crunched beneath his boots as he approached the abandoned sedan. Buddy immediately wagged his tail but remained fixed beside the rear door. Walter peered through the dusty window and froze. Beneath a collection of old blankets and worn clothing, a child stared back at him. The boy couldn't have been older than 12. Thin and pale, with messy brown hair hanging over frightened blue eyes, he looked as though he had not slept properly in days. He wore an oversized hoodie, several sizes too large, and clutched a backpack tightly against his chest. For several seconds neither spoke. Then the boy pushed himself upright. "Please don't call anybody," he said immediately. His voice trembled despite the effort to sound brave. Walter's first instinct was concern. The child looked exhausted. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, and the unmistakable signs of someone surviving outdoors for too long. "Easy, son," Walter replied gently. "I'm not here to hurt you." The boy glanced toward Buddy. Surprisingly, the Labrador had stopped barking entirely. Instead, he sat beside the car wagging his tail slowly. "Your dog found me," the boy said. Walter nodded. "Looks that way." The child lowered his gaze. "I wasn't stealing anything." "I never said you were." Walter opened the rear door carefully. The smell of cold air, damp blankets, and old upholstery drifted out. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated long enough to make Walter suspect the answer might not be real. "Ethan." "Well, Ethan, I'm Walter. And this troublemaker is Buddy. Buddy responded by gently pressing his nose against the boy's hand. To Walter's surprise, Ethan smiled. It was brief, almost accidental, but it transformed his entire face. Then the smile vanished as quickly as it appeared. Walter noticed something else. Fear. Not the ordinary fear of being discovered sleeping in a car. Something deeper. Every few seconds, Ethan looked toward the road beyond the garage, as though expecting someone to appear. Walter had seen that kind of vigilance before. Years earlier, when helping veterans returning from difficult deployments, he had noticed the same habit. People who were hiding from danger often watched exits without realizing it. "Have you eaten?" Walter asked. Ethan shook his head. 20 minutes later, the boy sat inside the garage office eating scrambled eggs and toast while Buddy rested beneath the table. Walter pretended to organize paperwork while quietly observing. Ethan devoured the food far too quickly for someone who had eaten recently. Yet despite his hunger, he remained constantly alert. Every passing vehicle drew his attention. Every unfamiliar sound made him glance toward the windows. The more Walter watched, the more concerned he became. Then it happened. A black pickup truck rolled slowly past the garage. The moment Ethan saw it, all color drained from his face. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Buddy immediately stood. A low growl emerged from the Labrador's throat. Walter turned toward the road. The truck continued past without stopping. Yet Ethan's hands shook noticeably. Buddy remained tense until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Silence settled across the office. Walter looked from the road to the frightened boy, and then to the dog. Years of experience taught him when something wasn't right. Buddy had noticed it before he had. And for the first time, Walter realized the child sleeping behind his garage wasn't simply lost. He was running from something. And whatever it was, it had just driven past looking for him. A pale autumn sun rose over Cedar Ridge the following morning, casting long golden shadows across the mountains surrounding the small Montana town. But the warmth of the day did little to ease the uneasiness that had settled inside Walter Miller's garage. Walter arrived before sunrise as usual, yet instead of thinking about repair orders and customer appointments, he found himself thinking about the frightened boy sleeping in the storage room behind his office. Ethan had fallen asleep almost immediately after finishing dinner the previous evening. Exhaustion had overtaken caution for the first time since Walter found him inside the abandoned sedan. The old mechanic had given him a folding cot, a clean blanket, and a warm place to rest. But even in sleep, the boy seemed unable to fully relax. Several times during the night, Walter had checked on him and found him tossing restlessly, waking at the slightest sound. At 71 years old, Walter had spent enough years around people to recognize the difference between a child avoiding trouble and a child escaping it. Ethan belonged in the second category. The problem was that Walter still had no idea what the boy was running from. Buddy, however, seemed convinced there was something wrong. The 10-year-old Labrador had slept beside the storage room door all night and now sat outside waiting patiently for Ethan to wake up. The dog's loyalty impressed Walter, but his instincts impressed him even more. Buddy loved people. Over the years, the Labrador had greeted thousands of customers without showing aggression toward anyone. Yet the previous afternoon, the dog had growled at the black pickup truck before Ethan ever reacted. That bothered Walter. Dogs notice things humans missed. Around 8 o'clock, Ethan emerged from the storage room, wearing a clean flannel shirt Walter found among some donated clothing kept for local families in need. The oversized shirt hung loosely from his thin frame, but it looked far better than the worn hoodie he had arrived in. Up close in proper daylight, Walter could see just how young the boy really was. Ethan appeared no older than 12. His brown hair needed cutting, and his face carried the tired look of someone who had spent too many nights worrying about tomorrow. Yet there was intelligence in his blue eyes, and a politeness that suggested he had not always lived the way he did now. "Morning," Walter said. Ethan offered a cautious nod. "Morning." Buddy immediately walked over and pushed his head against the boy's side. For the first time, Ethan laughed softly. The sound surprised all three of them. "I think he likes you," Walter said. "I noticed." Ethan scratched behind Buddy's ears while the Labrador's tail thumped happily against the floor. For a moment, the fear disappeared from the boy's face. Then a vehicle passed outside, and the smile vanished. The transformation happened instantly, Walter noticed. So did Buddy. The dog lifted his head and looked toward the window. Ethan did the same. "You're expecting someone," Walter said quietly. Ethan froze. Several seconds passed before he answered, "No." The response came too quickly. Walter chose not to push. Instead, he handed the boy a plate of pancakes and changed the subject. Throughout the morning, Ethan helped around the garage. He swept floors, organized tools, and cleaned workbenches without being asked. Customers assumed he was a grandson visiting for the weekend. Ethan rarely spoke, but when he did, he was polite and respectful. By lunchtime, Walter found himself liking the boy more than he expected. Yet the mystery surrounding him only deepened. Ethan knew far too much about vehicles for someone his age. He identified engine parts correctly. He understood basic repairs. At one point, he even pointed out a loose hose clamp another mechanic had missed. "Where'd you learn that?" Walter asked. Ethan hesitated. "My dad used to fix cars." "Used to." The wording caught Walter's attention. Before he could ask more, Buddy suddenly stood. The Labrador moved toward the front window overlooking the road. A low growl emerged from his throat. Every hair along his back rose. Ethan turned toward the street and immediately went pale. Walter followed their gaze. The black pickup truck was back. This time it drove much slower than before. The dark vehicle rolled past the garage, almost crawling along the road. The driver wore sunglasses and a baseball cap, making it impossible to see his face clearly. For several seconds, the truck remained directly in front of the building. Then it continued down the street and disappeared around the corner. Ethan looked as though he might be sick. His hands trembled visibly. Buddy remained beside him, pressing against his leg. Walter waited until the truck was gone. "Okay," he said calmly. "Now we're talking." Ethan stared at the floor. "I can't. Son, if someone is looking for you, I need to know why." The boy swallowed hard. His eyes filled with fear. Not fear of Walter, fear of something else. Something much larger. "If I tell you," he whispered, "they'll find me." Walter sat across from him. "Who's they?" Ethan didn't answer. Tears began forming in his eyes, and he quickly looked away. Walter immediately regretted pushing so hard. The boy was terrified. That much was obvious. Before the conversation could continue, the garage phone rang. Walter answered while Ethan remained at the table with Buddy. A familiar voice greeted him. Sheriff Daniel Harper. Daniel was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, and well-respected throughout the county. He had known Walter for nearly 30 years. "You got a minute?" the sheriff asked. "Sure." "Strange question. Have you seen a black pickup around town lately?" Walter felt his stomach tighten. "Why?" A pause followed. "We've received reports from several businesses. Same truck showing up repeatedly. Driver asking questions about a boy." Walter looked toward Ethan. The boy's face had gone completely white. Sheriff Harper continued speaking. "Description matches a missing child case from Idaho." Walter's grip tightened on the phone. "Missing child? 12-year-old named Ethan Brooks. Disappeared almost 6 weeks ago." Silence filled the office. Ethan lowered his head. The sheriff kept talking, unaware of what was happening on the other end of the line. "The strange part is nobody reported seeing family members looking for him. Just this guy in the truck." Walter stared at the boy. Ethan slowly closed his eyes. One tear slipped down his cheek. At that moment, Walter understood something important. Ethan wasn't hiding from the police. He wasn't hiding from social workers. He wasn't running because he wanted freedom. He was running because he was afraid of the people searching for him. And whatever the truth was, it was serious enough that a 12-year-old child would rather sleep in an abandoned car than be found. Buddy moved closer and rested his head on Ethan's knee. The boy wrapped both arms around the Labrador's neck, as if holding on to the only safe thing left in the world. Walter listened to the sheriff's voice for another moment before replying quietly. "Daniel, I think we need to talk." A cold rain arrived in Cedar Ridge that evening, tapping softly against the garage windows while dark clouds settled over the Montana mountains, and for the first time since Walter Miller found the boy sleeping behind his shop, the truth finally began to surface. After ending his call with Sheriff Daniel Harper, Walter locked the front office door and pulled the blinds closed. The garage remained open for business, but he wanted privacy for what came next. Ethan sat at the small table near the coffee machine with Buddy lying at his feet. The old Labrador had barely left the boy's side all day. Every time Ethan became nervous, Buddy moved closer. Every time a vehicle passed outside, the dog watched the road carefully before relaxing again. Walter had spent enough years around animals to know that Buddy trusted Ethan completely. That trust meant something. Sheriff Harper arrived 20 minutes later. At 60 years old, Daniel was a large man with silver hair, a weathered face, and the calm confidence that came from decades in law enforcement. Unlike some officers, he rarely rushed to conclusions. He listened first. That was one reason Walter trusted him. When Daniel entered the office and saw Ethan sitting at the table, recognition immediately crossed his face. The sheriff had reviewed photographs from the missing child bulletin earlier that morning. "You're Ethan Brooks," he said gently. Ethan lowered his eyes. "Yes, sir." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down. "Nobody here wants to hurt you." The boy nodded but said nothing. Walter poured coffee for himself and the sheriff before taking a seat nearby. For several moments, nobody spoke. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Buddy rested his head on Ethan's shoe. Finally, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Ethan, can you tell us why you're running?" The question lingered in the room. Ethan swallowed hard. Walter could see the conflict in his face. Part of him wanted to speak. Another part was terrified. "The man in the truck," Daniel said carefully. "Is he related to your disappearance?" Ethan's entire body tensed. That reaction alone answered part of the question. The sheriff noticed too. "What's his name?" Ethan stared at the floor. "Rick." Walter exchanged a glance with Daniel. "Rick who?" Ethan hesitated. "Rick Nolan." The sheriff's expression changed immediately. Very slightly. Most people would have missed it. Walter did not. Neither did Buddy, who suddenly lifted his head. Daniel remained calm. "You know him?" Walter asked quietly. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "I've heard the name." That wasn't a good answer. Everyone in the room knew it. Ethan's hands trembled. "He's not supposed to know where I am." Daniel looked at him carefully. "Why?" The boy's breathing quickened. For several seconds, Walter worried he might shut down completely. Then Ethan looked down at Buddy. The Labrador gazed back with the same steady loyalty he offered everyone he loved. Somehow, that seemed to help. Ethan finally spoke. "After my dad died, my mom married Rick." Silence followed. Walter felt his stomach tighten. Ethan continued. "At first he acted nice. Everybody liked him." The boy's voice remained low. Then things changed. Walter listened quietly. Years of life experience had taught him that some stories needed space. Ethan described how his father had died in a construction accident 3 years earlier. After struggling financially, his mother eventually married Rick Nolan, a trucking company owner who appeared successful and generous. To outsiders, Rick seemed respectable, helpful, friendly. Yet behind closed doors, Ethan saw a different man, a controlling man, an angry man, a man who became increasingly involved in activities he never wanted discussed. "I wasn't supposed to hear things," Ethan said. "But I did." Daniel remained completely still. "What kind of things?" Ethan looked toward the rain-covered window. "Meetings, phone calls, arguments." His voice trembled. People talked about money, fake shipping records, trucks carrying things they weren't supposed to. Walter frowned. Even he understood where the conversation was heading. "You think he was involved in criminal activity?" Ethan nodded slowly. "One night I heard him arguing with somebody." The boy's eyes filled with fear. He said if anyone found out, they'd disappear. The room became very quiet. Daniel folded his hands together. "Did you tell anyone?" Ethan shook his head. "I told my mom." Walter immediately noticed the pain in the boy's expression. "What happened?" "She didn't believe me." The words barely escaped above a whisper. Buddy moved closer. Ethan wrapped one arm around the Labrador's neck. "Then Rick found out I was asking questions." Walter's chest tightened. He already knew where the story was going. "What did he do?" Ethan looked directly at him for the first time. "He told me accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business." Rain continued falling outside. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Daniel asked the most important question. "Why run away?" Ethan's answer came immediately. "Because 2 weeks later, I saw him talking to someone about me." The sheriff's expression hardened. "About you?" Ethan nodded. He said he needed to deal with the problem before it became a bigger problem. Walter felt cold despite the heated office. Ethan wasn't running because he was rebellious. He wasn't avoiding school or responsibility. He genuinely believed he was in danger. The sheriff remained thoughtful for a long moment. Then he stood and walked toward the window. "Rick Nolan owns a regional trucking company," he said quietly. "We've investigated complaints before." Walter looked up. "And?" Daniel turned back. Nothing ever stuck. Ethan lowered his head. He's good at making people believe him. The sheriff nodded slowly. Maybe. Then he looked toward the boy. But if what you're saying is true, that changes things. For the first time all evening, a small flicker of hope appeared in Ethan's eyes. Not much, just enough. Then Buddy suddenly stood. A low growl emerged from his throat. Every person in the room turned toward the front window. Headlights appeared outside. A black pickup truck rolled slowly past the garage once again. This time it didn't keep driving. It stopped across the street. Nobody moved. The engine remained running. Rain streaked down the windshield. The driver sat motionless behind the wheel, watching. Ethan's face drained of color. Walter rose from his chair. Daniel reached for his radio. Outside, the truck remained parked beneath a streetlight, waiting, looking, searching. And for the first time, Walter realized this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. Someone had found Ethan. The only question now was what they planned to do next. A hard rain fell over Cedar Ridge that night, turning the streets glossy beneath the yellow glow of streetlights, while thunder rolled faintly across the distant Montana mountains. Inside Miller's Auto Repair, nobody took their eyes off the black pickup truck parked across the street. The engine continued idling. Rain streaked down the windshield, making it impossible to clearly see the driver's face. But the message was unmistakable. Whoever sat inside that vehicle knew where Ethan was. Sheriff Daniel Harper stood beside the office window with his phone already in hand while Walter Miller remained near the boy. Buddy positioned himself directly in front of Ethan, his usually gentle posture replaced by unusual alertness. The Labrador's ears stood high and his gaze never left the truck. Walter had owned dogs his entire life. He had never seen Buddy react this way toward a stranger. "Stay here," Daniel said quietly. He stepped outside beneath the garage awning, while another deputy, summoned by radio moments earlier, approached from the opposite direction in a patrol vehicle. The pickup remained motionless for several seconds. Then, as the patrol car entered the street, the driver accelerated and disappeared into the rain before officers could reach him. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it changed everything. Back inside the office, Ethan sat trembling. "He found me," he whispered. Walter pulled a chair closer. "Not this time." Ethan looked toward the door as if expecting the man to walk through it at any moment. "You don't understand. He always finds people." Sheriff Harper returned several minutes later, his expression grim. "We got the plate." Walter looked up. "And?" Daniel removed his hat and placed it on the desk. "The truck belongs to a company registered under Rick Nolan." Silence filled the room. The confirmation made the threat feel far more real. For years, Sheriff Harper had heard rumors surrounding Nolan's trucking business. Missing shipments, inconsistent records, complaints that never quite reached the level needed for formal charges. Nothing substantial enough to build a case. Until now. "I contacted state investigators," Daniel said. "They're reviewing everything." Ethan lowered his gaze. "He's going to come back." The sheriff knelt beside him. "Then we'll be waiting when he does." Despite the reassurance, Walter could see that fear still gripped the boy. The fear wasn't irrational. It came from months of living under constant stress, from believing that every unfamiliar vehicle might contain someone searching for him. Walter understood something else as well. Ethan had been carrying this burden completely alone. A 12-year-old child should not have to decide where to sleep each night, or whether the next stranger who recognized him might return him to danger. Later that evening, after the garage closed, Walter prepared a small meal, while Ethan sat with Buddy near the office heater. The Labrador remained unusually attached to the boy. At one point, Ethan absent-mindedly rested a hand on Buddy's head, and the old dog immediately relaxed. It was one of the few moments all day when the boy appeared calm. "You know," Walter said while setting plates on the table, "Buddy wasn't always this smart." Ethan managed a weak smile. "I think he was." Walter chuckled. "Trust me, he once ate an entire birthday cake off my kitchen counter." For the first time in hours, Ethan laughed. The sound lasted only a few seconds, but it felt important. Some part of the child beneath the fear was still there. The following morning brought unexpected news. A team from the Montana Department of Criminal Investigation arrived in Cedar Ridge. Leading the group was Special Investigator Rebecca Collins, a 46-year-old woman with sharp blue eyes, short auburn hair, and a reputation for refusing to let complicated cases remain buried. Years earlier, Rebecca had built major fraud investigations against several transportation companies across the western states. When Sheriff Harper explained Ethan's story and the repeated appearances of Rick Nolan's truck, she listened carefully without interruption. Then she asked to speak with Ethan privately. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. When Rebecca finally emerged, her expression carried a seriousness that immediately caught Walter's attention. "The kid's telling the truth," she said. "At least as far as he knows." Daniel folded his arms. "Enough to open an investigation?" Rebecca nodded. "More than enough." Over the next several days, investigators quietly examined Nolan's business records. What they discovered shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. Multiple trucking routes existed only on paper. Several deliveries listed goods that never reached their supposed destinations. Financial records revealed large sums of money moving through shell companies with no legitimate business purpose. Ethan had unknowingly stumbled onto something much larger than a troubled home situation. He had overheard conversations connected to an organized criminal operation involving transportation fraud and illegal cargo movements across several states. More importantly, investigators now believed Rick Nolan knew Ethan had heard enough to become a threat. The breakthrough came 3 days later. One of Nolan's former employees agreed to cooperate after learning about the investigation. His testimony confirmed many of Ethan's fears. Rick Nolan had been using his company to hide illegal activities for years. Anyone who threatened that operation was pressured, intimidated, or silenced. Fortunately, before any further action could be taken against Ethan, law enforcement moved first. Search warrants were executed simultaneously across multiple properties connected to Nolan's business. Offices were secured, records were seized, several associates were detained for questioning. The operation unfolded quickly and without incident. That evening, Walter sat outside the garage with Ethan and Buddy watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of orange and gold. For the first time since arriving, the boy looked genuinely relaxed. "Do you think it's over?" Ethan asked quietly. Walter looked toward the mountains. "I think it's getting close." Buddy rested beside them, tail thumping lazily against the wooden porch. The old Labrador seemed more peaceful now too, as though he sensed the danger fading. Then Walter noticed something remarkable. Ethan wasn't watching the road anymore. For days, the boy had checked every passing vehicle, every stranger, every shadow. Now he simply watched the sunset. It was a small change, but to Walter, it felt like the beginning of something much bigger. The beginning of a child finally believing he might be safe. And although the investigation was not yet finished, one thing had already become clear. Buddy had been right from the very beginning. The boy hiding in the abandoned car wasn't running from home. He was running toward a chance to survive. And because one old dog refused to ignore what he sensed, that chance was finally within reach. The first snow of the season arrived in Cedar Ridge 2 weeks later, dusting the Montana hills in white and covering the rooftops of the small town with a quiet layer of winter. The mountains beyond town looked brighter beneath the pale morning sun. And for the first time in many months, Ethan Brooks woke without fear, tightening his chest. He sat at the kitchen table inside Walter Miller's small house behind the garage, while Buddy rested beside the wood stove. The old Labrador opened one eye when Ethan entered the room, wagged his tail once, and then returned to his nap. It had become their routine. After the investigation expanded, Sheriff Daniel Harper and Special Investigator Rebecca Collins agreed that keeping Ethan with Walter temporarily was safer than placing him in a crowded shelter or moving him repeatedly between facilities. What started as a single night sleeping behind the garage had gradually become something closer to a home. Ethan helped around the shop during the day, attended classes remotely with assistance from local school staff, and spent evenings helping Walter prepare dinner while Buddy supervised from whatever warm spot he could find. The change in the boy was remarkable. The constant tension had begun to disappear. His shoulders no longer stiffened whenever a vehicle passed outside. He laughed more often. He slept through entire nights without waking in panic. Yet the biggest change came from something much deeper. For the first time in a long while, Ethan was beginning to trust people again. The investigation continued moving quickly. Evidence recovered from Rick Nolan's trucking company revealed a widespread transportation fraud operation involving falsified records, illegal cargo transfers, and financial crimes stretching across multiple states. Several business partners cooperated with authorities after realizing the scope of the case against them. Documents confirmed much of what Ethan had overheard months earlier. More importantly, Investigators discovered records showing repeated attempts by Nolan to locate Ethan after his disappearance. Those records became a critical piece of evidence. By early winter, federal prosecutors formally charged Nolan and several associates. The case drew significant media attention throughout Montana and neighboring states. Yet despite everything happening around him, Ethan remained focused on simpler things. School assignments, repairing engines with Walter, throwing tennis balls for Buddy, learning what ordinary life felt like. One afternoon, shortly before Christmas, Sheriff Harper arrived at the garage carrying news everyone had been waiting for. Walter, Ethan, and Buddy were working on an old pickup truck when the sheriff walked into the service bay. "Well," Daniel announced with a rare smile, "it's official." Walter set down a wrench. "What's official?" Rick Nolan accepted a plea agreement. Ethan froze. The sheriff nodded toward him. "It's over, son." The words hung in the air for several seconds. Ethan looked down at the concrete floor, then toward Buddy, then toward Walter. "Really?" Daniel smiled. "Really?" For a moment, nobody moved. Then Buddy walked over and nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. The gesture broke whatever emotional wall remained. Ethan dropped to one knee and wrapped both arms around the Labrador's neck. Tears filled his eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear. They were tears of relief, the kind that come when a burden finally becomes too heavy to carry alone. Walter quietly looked away to give the boy a moment. He understood. Some victories deserve silence. In the weeks that followed, social workers and family court officials worked to determine Ethan's future. His mother had eventually cooperated with investigators after learning the full truth about Rick Nolan's activities. She admitted she had ignored warning signs for too long and deeply regretted failing to protect her son. Although she hoped to rebuild their relationship someday, everyone involved agreed that healing would take time. During that process, another possibility emerged. One afternoon, Rebecca Collins visited the garage, carrying several documents. She sat with Walter in the office while Ethan worked outside. Buddy lay beneath the desk listening to the conversation as if he understood every word. "The court is looking at long-term placement options," Rebecca explained. Walter nodded. "I figured." Rebecca glanced toward the service bay window where Ethan could be seen laughing while changing a tire. "Have you considered becoming one of them?" Walter stared at her. "Me? The kid trusts you." She smiled slightly. "And honestly, so does the dog." Walter looked toward Buddy. The Labrador's tail thumped once against the floor. Over the following weeks, the idea that initially seemed impossible slowly became something else. Something real. By the time Christmas arrived, Walter already knew the answer. The official process took several more months, but spring eventually brought the outcome everyone secretly hoped for. On a warm April afternoon, Walter and Ethan returned from the county courthouse beneath clear Montana skies. Neither spoke much during the drive back. Some moments felt too important for unnecessary words. When they pulled into the garage parking lot, Buddy was already waiting near the entrance. The old Labrador barked happily and trotted toward the truck. Ethan climbed out first. Walter followed. For several seconds, they simply stood there. Then Walter handed the boy a folded document. Ethan opened it carefully. His eyes widened. "It's done?" Walter nodded. "It's done." The court had officially approved permanent guardianship. Ethan was no longer a runaway child hiding inside abandoned cars. He had a home, a family, a future. Tears filled the boy's eyes again. This time he didn't try to hide them. He stepped forward and hugged Walter tightly. The old mechanic returned the embrace without hesitation. Nearby, Buddy barked excitedly before running circles around both of them. The Labrador seemed delighted by the entire situation. Later that evening, the three sat together on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. Spring flowers had begun appearing across the valley. The garage stood quiet after another long day of work. Ethan tossed a tennis ball across the yard, while Buddy chased it with surprising enthusiasm for a dog his age. Walter watched them and smiled. Months earlier, he thought he had found a frightened boy sleeping in an abandoned car. The truth was much different. He had found family, and so had Ethan. As the sky turned gold above the Montana mountains, Buddy finally returned with the tennis ball and rested beside them. The old Labrador looked content. Maybe because his job was finally finished. After all, he had been the first to notice the boy, the first to understand that something was wrong. And because one loyal dog refused to ignore what his heart sensed, A lost child no longer had to face the world alone. In the end, Buddy didn't just help save Ethan's life. He helped him find a place to belong. Sometimes God places miracles in our path disguised as ordinary moments. For Walter Miller, it seemed like just another morning at his old garage in Montana. For Buddy, it was simply another walk across the repair yard. But for Ethan, that moment meant the difference between living in fear and finding hope again. What began with an old Labrador barking beside an abandoned car became the beginning of a completely new life. This story reminds us that not every cry for help is spoken out loud. Some people carry their pain in silence. Some children hide their fear behind brave faces. Some souls are hurting so deeply that they no longer believe anyone will notice them. Yet God often places compassionate people in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Walter did not have wealth, power, or special training. He simply had a kind heart and the willingness to care about a frightened child when it would have been easier to look away. Buddy's role in this story carries an important lesson as well. Animals often see what people miss. They sense fear, loneliness, and danger, long before others recognize it. The old Labrador could not speak, but his loyalty became a voice for a child who was too afraid to tell his story. In many ways, Buddy became the guardian God sent to watch over Ethan until the right people could help him. The world can sometimes feel full of people who are ignored, forgotten, or misunderstood. Yet this story shows that one act of kindness can change an entire future. A warm meal, a safe place to sleep, a patient conversation. These things may seem small, but in God's hands they can become life-changing gifts. Walter never set out to become a hero. He simply chose compassion over indifference. That choice made all the difference. Most importantly, Ethan's journey reminds us that our past does not have to determine our future. No matter how frightened, lost, or alone we may feel, God can open doors we never expected. He can place people in our lives who help us heal, rebuild, and discover that we are loved. Sometimes family is not only the people we are born with. Sometimes family is the people God brings into our lives when we need them most. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever experienced a moment when a stranger's kindness changed your life? Or perhaps a loyal pet helped you through a difficult season? We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about faith, second chances, loyal animals, and the extraordinary ways God works through ordinary people. May God bless you and your family, guide you through every challenge, and remind you that no one is ever truly forgotten in His eyes. And may you always remember that sometimes the miracle you've been praying for arrives with muddy paws, a wagging tail, and a heart full of love.